The Battle of Gettysburg. Overview and Day 3. The Battle of Gettysburg was one of the most pivotal battles of the Civil War. This battle was a major victory for the Union, but for the families of many soldiers it was a time of mourning. Countless lives were lost in what was known as one of the most decisive and bloodiest battles of the Civil War. The battle began on July 1st, 1863 in the small farm town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. General Lee marched his troops into the town to find much-needed supplies. He hoped to avoid fighting in the area, but the two armies encountered each other. General Meade, who was in charge of the Union Army at the time, was outnumbered. Him and his men retreated to a section of highland called Cemetery Ridge. Union troops stayed here and took the high grounds. That night, both sides called for reinforcements. General Meade gathered so many more troops by the next day that he now had more men than Lee. On Day 2, the Union held a position on Little Round Top and Big Round Top. The Confederates planned to march up and attack the Union, but the Union abandoned the Round Tops. Later, another attack was planned on the Round Tops, and fighting was inevitable there. By that time, there were about as many men dead as there were alive. Both armies were doing the best they could, but the Confederates were struggling. However, they didn't give up. Later that night, Robert E. Lee wrote about his experience. "The army did all it could. I fear I required of it impossibilities." On the third day, Confederates were surrounding General George Sickles' troops. Now, Confederates were fighting more persistently than ever. Men laid on the ground as others quickly fell, some losing limbs on the way down. While General Sickles' troops were still trying to hold back the Confederates, General Lee was devising a plan to destroy the Union troops by creating panic. The Confederates were told to fire all their artillery in different directions, focusing on where the Union troops were. They were firing nearly 140 cannons all at once. Then, under the control of General George Pickett, the Confederate troops were ordered to charge the Union troops. This was later known as Pickett's Charge. However, Pickett's charge was not a success. Meade's army fought off most of the Confederate troops, and almost all of them were dead or wounded later. This sight was terrifying to many. Some found it so disturbing that they chose to write about it. A 15-year-old girl named Tilly Pierce later recalled her experience. "What a horrible sight! There they were, human beings, clad almost in rags, covered with dust, riding wildly, pell-mell down the hill toward our home, shouting, yelling most unearthingly, cursing, brandishing their revolvers, and firing right and left. I was fully persuaded that the rebels had actually come at last. What they would do with us was a fearful question to my young mind. Soon the town was filled with infantry, and then the searching and ransacking began in earnest." The fighting later subsided, but the amount of death and disease just went up and up as the battle ended. Of the 262 men of one Minnesota regiment, only 47 survived. In one Alabama regiment, everyone died. Many generals were astounded by the amount of wounded men and the cries of battle. They would write letters to their loved ones and tell them about that. In a letter to his fiancée, George E. Pickett wrote, "The sacrifice of life on that blood-soaked field was too awful for the heralding of victory, even for our victorious foe." So that was it. The Union had managed to achieve a great victory. They stopped the Confederates from gaining help from Britain and France, who were supposed to give them ships but later decided not to. However, both sides suffered enormous loss of men. The Union lost about 23,000 men, while the Confederates lost 28,000 men, which combined is 51,000 men. The amount of damage and defeat done that day was worth it for the Union. This battle brought on a winning streak for them, which later helped them win the Civil War.